Hello and welcome to the Swim Brief. I'm coming to you here grizzled and from my kitchen at home, essentially because I had a swim meet over the weekend. And, um, you know, I know many of you listening to this are probably swim coaches. We were at our senior long course championships. I had a few 16-hour days in a row, and now I'll spend the rest of the week just physically trying to recover because I have another meet coming up in a week. So apologies for not bringing you a full podcast covering the events, but simply I'm almost too absorbed with the things that I'm doing at the moment to do justice to stuff like the World Championships or responding to the angry Romanians in the comment thread on my David Popovich video. But I will say to them, I know that Romania is not a Soviet country, and I'm sorry if no, I'm not sorry. I'm not sorry if I'm sorry. Period. For having that said on my podcast. I don't remember whether I said it or Joel said it, but I'm embarrassed as a history nerd for letting that slide. So I hope all is forgiven. I don't want any Romanians on my bad side. What I want to talk about this week is, again, something that's top of mind because I was just at a meet, and that is three situations, and you can probably think of more that fit this category, but I'm just going to talk about three different situations, that are amazing for getting your top level swimming performance out. I'm going to talk a little bit psychologically about why that is, or why I think that is, and then hopefully some ideas for how you might replicate some of that in what you're doing if you're an athlete or if you're a coach listening to this. So the moment that I got inspired to do this was I'm sitting there at our senior championship meet, and I'm staring down at the blocks, and I'm staring at my heat sheet, and I see an empty lane where a swimmer from our team should be. And, as coaches, we immediately go into panic mode, trying to find the swimmer. Now, in this case, sitting all the way at the other end of the pool, I'm ruthless, so I wouldn't have been upset at all if the official had said, "Hey, you didn't show up for your race. You're disqualified," right? And all the other consequences for not showing up for your race. The much nicer than me officials actually allowed our swimmer to run. Another thing I'm cringing at, running on a pool deck, run down to the other end of the pool, put his cap on, and dive in and swim. And this was a 400 IM, just for context. And probably most of you that are swim coaches know exactly what happened. He swam awesome. Now, the reason why it's worth noting is because we would never draw up a situation like that as coaches, right? We would never say, "Hey, you know what the best way to prepare for your race is? Don't pay attention to when it is, okay? Just sit on your butt for 15, 20 minutes before it starts. And then you just get a signal, and I want you to activate instantly and do like a really, really get your heart rate up to, 200 beats per minute in about 60 seconds, and then just dive in and swim." Okay. Now, maybe there's some crazy guys out there who are listening to this who go like, "Oh, no, yeah, that's what I tell people to do." Whatever, you're full of it. Okay. You wouldn't draw that up as a strategy, and yet it works. It works. I've seen it consistently work. I don't actually recall if I've ever seen somebody who was in that situation where they got surprised by the fact that they were about to do their race and didn't do well subsequently, right? And there's a couple other situations that I see this in. I can remember when I was assistant coach at Georgia Tech. We had a backstroker. Her name was Ilya Eisenstock. Ilya was our best 200 backstroke swimmer. And we weren't getting the dual meet performances we wanted out of Ilya. Okay. I think he was, had been like a 143. Now it was like a suit year that year. But like he was showing up to a lot of dual meets, and by my recollection, I'd have to go into the archives to find out for sure, but there's a lot of like 156, two backs in these dual meets, and it was costing us result wise in dual meets. And I remember at some point during the season, we offered him a get out swim. Now, for those of you not familiar with the concept of get out swim, I'm sure many of you probably heard of one. You can, like tell a swimmer basically, if you want to get out of practice, and maybe it's them, maybe it's everybody else, beat a certain time, right? And I can't remember what bar we set for Ilya in this race, but it was definitely something faster than what he'd been doing in dual meets. And I also remember that he went a 150. And so, this is the form of this that can almost be rage inducing, because you're thinking, okay, you have that capability, you're capable of producing that kind of result. And yet, when the race starts, you just, in a real competitive situation, you just end up swimming something that's nowhere near that. And I think I recall confronting him and just saying, like, what's up with that, man? Like, you had that the whole time, and I'm watching you do this. And he was kind of joking back with me, and he said, you got to understand the hierarchy of like swimming performance. And I've thought about it a lot since then. And some of you are probably going to still listen to it and be enraged, and it is enraging on a certain level. But he was sort of like, and I'm making motions with my hands for those of you listening to the audio version, but sort of at a low level, you have normal practice, like race pace stuff, and then a tier up from that, you have dual meets, and then you have championship meets. Then he was like, and then there's get out swim, and then there's finals at a championship meet. So the only thing that he had as a sort of, and he didn't mean to say that it was more important. He just said the like sort of psychic energy that you could naturally bring to a performance was that high when you were doing a get out swim. And the last situation, and this came up as well, because there was a situation at the meet where essentially the timing system malfunctioned and swimmers were offered a re-swim. I'm going to lump in this one in with another category of swim, which is the swim off, right? Where you have two swimmers that tie in something, they need to determine a place for finals, so they're offered a swim off. Okay. These to me are also gigantic gimmies in terms of performance. So, we had two swimmers that were offered re-swims in a 50 free, and did they go faster? Yes, they did. in both cases in that swim off, in that re-swim. Have I ever witnessed somebody swim slower than they did to tie for a certain time in the subsequent swim off? Not to my recollection. So again, you have like a certain benchmark of performance, and then immediately, even though you maybe are doing it, at the end of a long session, or, all these sorts of conditions, again, that we can go over that are not ideal. The other one, the swim off, the get out swim, you're talking about an unsuited practice performance, right? Not that he was suited for a lot of dual meets, but like, it was the second fastest 200 backstroke of the year, and you have these people swimming really fast in swim offs as well. And re-swims fit that category also. Now there's a couple environmental factors I just want to get into that There's a unique thing for the swim off, especially for sprint events, that I think you can't state when you want to sort of get into the more of the psychological case for it. You can't miss saying that it is just an advantage in a 50 free to race with less people in the pool. There's less turbulence in the water. It's easier to catch water and get into your stroke and sort of control what you're doing. And I could see it too with one of these swimmers that only 3 swimmers took the re-swim. So you had a 50 free heat with just 3 people and lots of empty water around. That is a tremendous advantage. But if I look at psychologically what all of these types of swims have in common is they have very little opportunity for athletes to overthink the situations. Think of the psychology. The one I presented first, right? The oops, I missed my swim situation. That's the most obvious, right? Because you literally don't have time to think. If you think, you're really are going to miss your race. You're not going to get up there. And so you have to, by necessity, I should say, just get yourself locked in and get it in race. Now, some of the others are a little less obvious, but I think when you think about it a little bit longer, it becomes pretty clear. So in a swim off situation, right? So many times athletes go into a race with a certain performance expectation, right? Whether we like it or not. And for the most part, I think we would say we don't like it, although, maybe we like it a little bit more than we do because we all pay attention to, as coaches, we all pay attention to what the times are too. We want people to get faster because faster is a higher level of performance. So, but we also know that a fixation on that can be really counterproductive to moving forward. When you're in a swim off situation, it really strips away a lot of the, like, how am I doing type of thinking and stress, or how am I going to do? You have a very simple mission. You're racing another person. That person is literally evenly matched with you. Like, it's not as if you're racing another person and that person's way better than you or you're way better than them, right? So you have this great, almost perfect single competitor, single combat race, and you're just trying to touch before them. And so when you have a lot of that sort of time performance expectation stripped away, that can help a ton, right? And if you look at a good get out swim, I don't know what the rest of you are doing out there, but I always made a habit, I should say, of making get out swims extremely spontaneous, right? So replicating more of the oops, and just saying, like, literally while swimmers were resting on the wall and they maybe had 30 seconds to a minute to think about it, say X person, X time right now. And, and we're done, essentially. So, and you might have like a little bit more setup again, but again, it's not enough time for nearly anybody. I know you're all thinking of the one example, the person you have that has actually could potentially overthink something in a situation like this, but for the vast majority of people you coach, it's just not enough time to overthink. It's just like, okay, get up. Now I'm going to try as hard as I possibly can. And then they do, right? So what of this can you replicate? Okay. Because obviously, as we said, there's no replicating, you can't put a sensory. I joked with another coach, like, what if we had just a sensory deprivation chamber on deck, and we could just keep certain athletes like in there without any sense of what was going on at the meet, and then just pop them out and go, you're racing in 60 seconds, like that would be my completely imperfect solution to replicating the oops, I forgot to race phenomenon. So how do we replicate some of this, or how do we make some of this situational stuff work for us, if we're an athlete or we're a coach? I think the first thing to recognize is, um, you do need, and I fall into this trap all the time as a coach, you do need some unpredictability in the way that you prepare people. Okay. So this is really hard because, and I think this goes for athletes as well, if you're going to be really successful as a coach, it's actually quite important that you're organized and that you have planned things and that you always have, things planned 2, 3 steps in advance. But I know where I fall apart is once I make a plan for something, I have a very hard time changing the plan. Right? I'm very rigid. I want to follow what I'm doing. And I know that, it's just not natural for me to change it. But the thing about competition is, and the thing about, especially with these examples of competition, is that all sorts of unpredicted eventualities can can come to pass. And you probably have noticed, if you're a coach, actually, also if you're an athlete, you have probably experienced, being tremendously consistent, or you have an athlete that's tremendously consistent in what they do, and then you go, this level of performance is not matching up at all with what I'm seeing in practice. And part of that is because they've actually become a victim of their own success formula. So that consistency that they're bringing has, dulled their edge a little bit, and made them have a really hard time responding to dynamic situations that they're going to face competitively, right? Whether it be, what other people are doing in the pool, or, competing in a completely different environment, or, oh, the race, we're off the timeline, we're ahead of the timeline, we're behind the timeline. If you are too used to having everything very rigidly set for you, you're going to be really disturbed when unpredictable stuff happens, and not in the good, like take your mind off it way, in a heavy stress inducing way, right? And not in that acute 60-second stressful way that does, for the most part, just get you ready to compete, as I saw in that example, in a progressive sort of building, de-energizing kind of way. So you need to introduce some forms of dynamism to your workout. What can you do? You can, like, I think if you're a swimmer and, for instance, you're doing best average stuff, you should not fall into the trap of valuing consistency above all. Okay, so leave some room for, I'm going to try way too hard on one of these reps randomly, like, and just see what happens from there. Because, for one thing, this is just good advice, because, sometimes you're just best averaging way below your capability. And once you push it up and you just see how long you can sustain something, then you realize your max capability is much better, and like you've barely been training for a long period of time. But, also as a coach, just to sort of shake people up in the middle of something, or even change the set in the middle, which I know is, again, for me, very, very hard. But to introduce a bit of unpredictability in what you do. Now, I admit it's been a pretty long time since I've actually used a get out swim. I don't think, it's just not really a part of what we do at Jersey Wahoos. Different parts of my career, I use them quite a bit more. And I think there is some value on an individual level with getting people, sort of provoked in that way, because it can change their their complete confidence in what they're capable of for a future meet performance. It's not going to do it on its own. And you have to be really strategic and thoughtful about it. And you have to balance it out with the fact that, like, are you going to let everybody out of practice when that's maybe not the best thing for anybody else, or even the swimmer that you're doing, you're thinking about doing it with, right? So you have to balance all these decisions, but having something unpredictable like that as well. And then finally, finding a way to simplify race preparation for your athletes, and simplify it in a couple ways. First, I think that if you can't tell somebody, or I always think as an athlete, if you can't explain your strategy in one sentence, it's probably too complex. And there are strategies for taking a more complex strategy and boiling it down into a one sentence so your mind associates it. And I'll go into that probably on another podcast. So if you're interested in that, you just let me know. But there is a technique for doing that, but still you should be able to have a very, very simple mission in any competition, just the same way you do in a swim off. That's like, my mission here is to beat the other person. It doesn't always need to be to beat the other person, but your mission should be really, really simple, so that you don't have your mind thinking like, I gotta like make sure I build into the first wall and then 6 dolphin kicks coming off, and it's gotta make, like, nobody has time for that. Nobody has time to think that much when they're competing as hard as they can. And if they actually devote the amount of brain power that it takes to think through all those things, they're not going to be nearly trying their hardest in what they're doing. And then the other thing is, you want there to be really sort of defined space between race prep at a meet and everything else. Okay. And as much as you really only want as much race prep as is necessary, and you want it to be engaging enough that athlete doesn't have enough time to think too much about everything else. So I think about this all the time, because I need to do this to myself, is in order to, for instance, just get myself to relax. Like, I've always needed activities that are engaging enough so that my brain enters a flow state while doing them, right? And doesn't pay attention to the passage of time. But then I also need some way of, not just being so absorbed in something that, like, I lose track of all my life obligations, and I need to build systems around that as well. And I think that's what many athletes need. They need some engagement outside of the race, something that their brain needs to work a little bit on. It's not necessarily a distraction, it's actually productive to what they're about to do, but it is not so mindless that they can do it while, essentially ruminating over the upcoming race, because that has never worked in the history of sport, and it never will work, that heavy sort of thought rumination on a future performance. So anyway, that's my whole discussion on this topic. Spent a lot of time thinking about this over the weekend and some of the applications therein. I hope you enjoyed this one. I hope you enjoyed hearing a bit about some funny meet situations. I hope it made you think about some times that you've been in the same situation. Trying to build more engagement on the YouTube channel. So if you listened to any part of this and it reminded you of anything from your own experience in the sport of swimming, please comment below, like this podcast, subscribe, okay? Because I would really appreciate the growth in that regard. And I'm enjoying actually a lot interacting with people on YouTube. So I'll be sure to interact with you should you post something. And if you got topics that you're interested in hearing about that you think maybe I might be able to say something halfway intelligent about, drop those in there as well. And I'll be looking for them. Until next week, thank you for listening. And that was a swim brief.